here is what everybody should know about mainstream dogma. Earlier this year I wrote the following about the state of the world. Distortion of reality by tightly controlled media and highly censored social media and by actor politicians has become so intense that most people have disconnected from reality on many dimensions. Democracy has long been dysfunctional, with manipulation of electoral results and control of candidates for election making a mockery of democratic processes, and the roles of unelected officials coming to dominate those of elected ones. In this environment, vast and completely fabricated narratives have been successfully launched upon unsuspecting populations. Number one, with respect to COVID, there was no viral pandemic, and the mRNA vaccines were utter frauds and dangerous to boot. With respect to climate change, the carbon dioxide output of humans is irrelevant. With respect to central banking, your money is continually being stolen by currency debasement. With respect to immigration, the flood of refugees is really a planned importation of people chosen to extinguish local culture and mores. With respect to all publicized wars, the causes and motives are misrepresented and the interests they serve are obscured. With respect to trans rights, trans people have degenerate cognition, not legitimate knowledge of what it is like to be the other gender. It does not matter whether this situation reflects planning on the part of a shadowy elite or is emergent from the decline of your or our civilization. No matter who you vote for or what gloss your preferred candidate puts on these issues, nothing will change until you and enough of the people around you wake up to reality and launch a campaign of consistent non-compliance with the anti-human trajectory that manipulative elites have set upon us. It does not matter whether you label the centralizing ambitions of those elites as socialism, communism, technocracy, globalism, or fascism. It doesn't matter whether you see them as reflecting philanthropic, criminal, or even satanic motives. The important thing about centralization is that it absolutely requires censorship and comprehensive obliteration of rights and freedoms to persist, and that it is wholly incompatible with the flourishing of human beings. As a bit of backdrop to that kind of statement, that State of the World Declaration, 5 years ago I became part of a minority who saw through the COVID scam and warned of it being a harbinger of global technocratic surveillance states. We spoke of a forthcoming digital control grid, an age of digital feudalism, the advent of digital IDs and programmable central bank digital currencies, and of the weaponization of the so-called Sustainable Development Goals, the SDGs of the United Nations. People who called us conspiracy theorists are now starting to look pretty foolish because developments are advancing in COVID-like lockstep and at lightning pace. We are witnessing the wholesale destruction of cultures and countries of the West, and I include South Africa in that grouping. And we are witnessing the hyper-aggressive colonialism of forced investment into costly and economically catastrophic renewable energy economies throughout the developing world, and deliberate political destabilizations of nations that do not comply. Mainstream media dogma continues to hold to the charmingly childish perspective that the West consists of democracies where the popular will is expressed, but nothing could be further from the truth. It made no difference at all that Trump defeated Kamala Harris. Like Zelensky in the Ukraine, Trump and Harris are both constructs with merely superficial differences, devoid of political experience and simply furthering what we might call uni-party interests, whether they aspire to or not. As proof of that assertion, especially to those of you who may be Trump or MAGA fans, I would like to offer you some brutal facts. Within about 100 days of Trump taking office, Palantir, a surveillance business established by Peter Thiel with backing from In-Q-Tel, which is the CIA's commercial technology arm, had been endowed with massive state funding. 10 billion from the US Army, another 1 billion or so from the Departments of Homeland Security and Defense, and from the Pentagon. At the same time, and with no mention in the media, Trump absolutely tore down structures focused on safeguarding data privacy, allowing government agencies to share data points on citizens without limits. Also salient was what Trump did not do. He did not reverse Obama's deletion of a law that made it illegal for the US government to propagandize and lie to US citizens. Now, all of these steps were the continuation of what is essentially a century-long trajectory built around two significant pillars. Firstly, a merged intelligence community that incorporates the CIA, MI6 and Mossad, and secondly, what we may call the Anglo-American establishment, the opaque power structure supervening over the Bank of International Settlements, the City of London, a political structure that has sat outside control of the British Crown for 1,000 years, and of course over Wall Street. As an introduction to the intelligence community pillar, I would like to invite those of you who may be feeling a little bit uncomfortably skeptical at this stage in my talk. I'd like to invite you to whip out your iPhones right now and to look up the entry on Wikipedia for Operation Gladio. Just do it, because sorry. Operation Gladio. So Gladio is Gladio. Because I'd like you to verify what I'm about to tell you about it.
On Wikipedia?
Yeah, even on Wikipedia. That's the point. I don't regard Wikipedia as anything but a globalist mouthpiece. But even if they even agree with me on this point, I think it counts for something. Operation Gladio was a covert CIA operation established after World War II. The OSS, which was the precursor to the CIA, left behind American soldiers in Europe, about 20,000 of them, instead of withdrawing them, instructing them to hide weapons and remain in place until needed. The stated purpose was to combat communism and socialism, but the operation evolved into a network of covert, often terrorist activities. These actions included bombings and assassinations in Italy and Germany, such as the 1980 Bologna train station bombing that killed 85 and injured another 285, and the 1989 assassination of a journalist investigating the operations of Operation Gladio, as well as the 1978 kidnapping and murder of Italian Prime Minister Aldo Moro. Just reflect on that. This is the US government carrying out terrorist activities and trying to pin them on terrorist organizations. These acts were allegedly designed to manipulate political outcomes by instilling fear and shifting public opinion. The operation, which involved a network of up to 20,000 operatives across Europe, was officially ended when? Only in 1990. Just contemplate that. From 1945 to 1990, this thing was in full swing. And it was George Bush Sr., former head of the Central Intelligence Agency, who closed it down. So he would have known about the operation in its entirety while he was director of Central Intelligence. But its legacy persisted, with some individuals imprisoned for terrorist acts later being released due to court-led evidence implicating the CIA. Now, the theoretical termination of Operation Gladio cannot be read as any kind of meaningful circumscription of intelligence community activity. What had happened is that by 1990, the CIA had become completely adept at circumventing laws that limited its overseas activity. It did this by commandeering what are known as cutout organizations, such as USAID and the NED, which is the National Endowment for Democracy. It augmented state funding of these cutouts by way of capturing foundations. Somebody leaves a huge bequest, trustees have to be chosen. They basically infiltrate these foundations and start channeling fundings into dark operations. And some of these are quite big name foundations, such as the Brookings Institute, the Johns Hopkins School of Advanced International Studies, and the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. The signs of such institutional capture are far from subtle. For example, Bill Burns, who ran the Carnegie Endowment for 7 years, left it to become the current director of the CIA. It's just, you can't make it up. So which suggests not just that they're in contact, but there's substantial overlap between the two. Since 1990, a long string of regime change activities, the so-called color revolutions, have been conducted, allegedly involving the CIA, the USAID, and the NED. The Rose Revolution in Georgia in 2003, right on Russia's borders, was preceded by USAID and NED funding and organizational support for computerizing voter rolls, supporting opposition parties and NGOs, and training and funding youth groups inspired by the Yugoslav Otpor movement. Another color revolution has been more or less permanently underway since 2023. The CIA simply doesn't want to accept the answer that Georgia might have an interest in being friendly with Russia. Before the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, which was in 2004-2005, the same organizations funded pro-democracy, non-governmental organizations supporting the pro-democracy movement, with Ron Paul citing $60 million of funding through cutout NGOs. Similar actions were observed around the Ukrainian Euromaidan protests from 2013 to 2014. And yet George Soros would have you believe that it was all down to Vladimir Putin waking up on the wrong side of bed one day. And one can tell similar stories about the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan in 2005, the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005, the Arab Spring in the 2010s, the Sunflower Movement in Taiwan in 2014, 2020 protests in Belarus, 2022 protests in Peru, 2014 protests in Egypt, 2016 protests in Brazil that led to the resignation of President Morales, and the 2007 Saffron Revolution in Myanmar. I've cited a dozen, just like that, and I could carry on. I could make a whole talk just about the color revolutions in the last 20 years. And all of them have this abiding stench of intelligence community action and activity. So these are not isolated incidents. This is not anything unusual. They constitute evidence of an intelligence community that has the resources and capability to ensure that virtually every nation on earth, with perhaps 5 exceptions in total, is bent to the will of the establishment trajectory. To close the loop on the intelligence community chapter of this, in perhaps comical fashion, Victoria Nuland, the high priestess of US regime change, who was closely connected to the 2-decade destruction of the Ukraine that is still so tragically underway, was last month appointed as a director of the National Endowment for Democracy. You absolutely can't make it up. I'll also add that it is my belief that the intelligence communities of the US, the UK, and Israel have formed more or less a single merged criminal entity, and has been in that position for most of the last century, and that it has been several decades since it was possible to expect them to act congruently with their supposed sponsor country interests. They're a law unto themselves. I turn now to the second pillar of all of this, from the intelligence community to the financial community, and to the world of the Bank of International Settlements. Earlier this year, while explaining how this seldom heard of organization bears down on humanity, I wrote the following response to a question about remarks made by President Carney of Canada. Just to fill in some gaps there, I want to remind you of the history there. Carney had previously been governor of the Bank of England, so he was very close to this whole Bank of International Settlements crowd. I said, the Anglo-American establishment, using its de facto control over the City of London, will cause the Bank of International Settlements to amend the Basel regulatory framework so that corporate lending rates and even access to loans will depend on compliance with the net zero objectives. They will sweep up countries instead of corporates via loan conditions implanted by the IMF and the World Bank. And just as a reminder, those are both organs of the United Nations. All of this will circumvent sovereignty and democratic processes. And all of this is in the name of an entirely fake crisis and involves renewables projects that are truly staggering in their corruption. When those renewables projects flop financially, the terms and conditions of those investments will leave ownership of the assets in establishment hands, and they will use that position to charge everyone more and more for less and less reliable power, milking humanity dry while laughing all the way to the bank. This summarizes succinctly how the Bank of International Settlements takes direct actions, but it also wields power in the corridors of subsidiary policymakers. The key ones worth mentioning are the Club of Rome, the Council for Foreign Relations, Chatham House, the Rockefeller Foundation, and the World Economic Forum, as well as the Tony Blair Institute for Global Change. Collectively, these entities treat national governments as merely the enforcement arms for globalist policies. Who can forget Klaus Schwab's idle boast, "Wie penetrate the cabinets?" Now, the question that needs to be asked is whether these two pillars, the intelligence community and the financial community headed by the Bank of International Settlements, whether they meet at the top in some way. Is there a common locus of control? And comprehensive argument that they do can be found in such books as Carol Quigley's The Anglo-American Establishment, Adam Labor's Tower of Basel, McGregor and Dowd's Two World Wars and Hitler, and David Hughes's Wall Street, the Nazis, and the Crime of the Deep State. So we're talking about a period of history covered there that's almost we're getting on to 100 years now. But by my lights, it was the COVID phenomenon that furnished the best evidence with its lockstep implementation of novel and hitherto advised against policies and mandates, its institutionally elaborate suppression of dissent, and so on. Although the public was led to believe that the US Department of Health and Human Service and its organs, the Center for Disease Control and the National Institutes of Health, were performing their expected roles, Anthony Fauci was mere window dressing. Behind the scenes, it was the intelligence community operating through the Department of Defense that held power, and it was actually global power with respect to the COVID policy. What mainstream media completely failed to mention was that Pfizer's contract had nothing to do with conducting clinical trials of a vaccine, but about providing production capacity for what was known as a biological countermeasure. In a whistleblower trial alleging that the trials that were reported to the HHS had been invalidly conducted, Pfizer didn't defend itself by arguing that they were validly conducted, but by arguing that in terms of its contract with the US military, it was under no obligation to conduct valid clinical trials. And that argument was successful. In other words, they were quite right. The legal framework within which these products, the so-called vaccines, had been launched had nothing to do with the emergency use authorization and type approval frameworks that you would expect to see. This was purely a contract for the manufacturing of a biological countermeasure, and the judge agreed, said, doesn't matter if the trials are invalid. And you know, they really were a complete sham. It's just staggered me how few people have actually read the paltry documents that came out of Pfizer in the phase 3 trials and their reactogenicity trials. they're really just a little bit of tinsel in the rest of this magnificent window dressing. And on the basis of that, a novel genetic treatment was plunged into billions of arms. And those injections have been a disaster, involving mortality and morbidity rates much more significant than those of the purported SARS-CoV-2 virus. But media control has been intense, and governments all over the world have stonewalled attempts to get to the population level data. Just last week, the UK's creepily renamed Health Security Agency, the old NHI, refused to publish data that would tie excess deaths to the injections, arguing, and this is fascinating, that this would lead to distress or anger on the part of bereaved relatives. Risking what? Damaging the well-being and mental health of the families and friends of people who died. That's their wording. I mean, the cynicism is off the charts. One of the key ways in which this lockstep pursuit of irrational and untested mandates and injections was enforced was financial. Countries that locked down ran up deficits quickly, and loans to finance those deficits were simply made dependent on ongoing implementation of the measures. So I think that the inference that there is an opaque common control structure operating at a level above the Bank of International Settlements and the intelligence community, both of which are simply enforcement arms, is very hard to negate. So what lies ahead? Possessed of sufficient time, I would have taken you through the burgeoning and labyrinthine architecture that sees data from intelligence community surveillance infrastructure fed into a systems-based decision-making apparatus that enables algorithmic scientific governance to replace democratic deliberation, and how a web of treaties and accords render national governments increasingly powerless to resist this. I would also have loved to dilate on the role that South African leaders like Cecil John Rhodes and unfortunately Jan Smuts played in establishing the seminal bodies that developed the slowly encroaching technocracy. Suffice it to say that what remains of national and individual sovereignty is at this point, I believe, almost entirely illusory. That their ultimate and more naked removal can only be averted by a massive awakening to the realities of the trap that is being set. But from what I see, that awakening is far from happening in most people. I walk around in South Africa and I'm continually amused about people's wishing, if only the ANC would do this or the DA would do that. But this is to operate at a level of extraordinary naivety. Similarly, to believe that Trump's victory over Harris is going to save us is deeply foolish. Nothing that's important for any country on the planet is decided by politicians. Nothing. We are way past that point. Anything important, whether it's education or energy policy, is set in the corridors of power in Geneva, London, and New York. And you don't even know by whom. Unfortunately, history doesn't offer much hope. It seems always to have been the case that an inexorable rise in centralization and in the size of the state is in the first place a feature of empire, and in the second place solved only by eventual systemic collapse. Given the fragility of the global system of integrated supply chains and financing circuits, that is a very tough outcome to wish for. It would be disastrous. But I think it's a certain outcome. The problems of centralization are never solved by the presence of more data or faster processing or the advent of AI or whatever. So the only optimism that I cling to is that humans are adept problem solvers, and that the conditions under which knowledge generation can occur have not yet entirely been snuffed out. So on that, I'll thank you for your time and hope that I have a few minutes to take questions. I do. Okay.